Shalom Hovering, James Trim here. Today I want to talk to you about what Paul says about meat offered up to idols in 1 Corinthians. Is this a contradiction with what we read in Acts about meat offered up to idols? It's a really appropriate time of year, by the way. The time I'm actually making this video is December 17th. Hanukkah this year begins the evening of December 25th. And so Hanukkah is approaching, it's that time of year, and this actually has to do, strangely enough, with a significant Hanukkah story. So what does Hanukkah have to do with Paul's statement about meat offered up to idols, and whether or not that contradicts what Acts 15 and 21 say about meat offered up to idols? That's what we're going to talk about today. Before I get going, I need to ask you to please support this work. We need your donations to make this work possible, and you are the people that make this work possible. And for those that don't know, my wife is chronically ill, suffers chronic pain, and is disabled, and I'm her at-home caretaker, in addition to doing this great work. So we need your financial support, and you can do that by clicking on the donate link in the video description. You can donate by PayPal, Zelle, or GoFundMe, or you can just send donations by PayPal to donations@wnae.org. Or, like I said, you can go to the link in the video description and click on that, and from there you can donate by PayPal, Zelle, or GoFundMe. We'd also love to keep in touch with you by email, so if you'd like to subscribe to my emails, you can do that by clicking on the video description. Going to the video description, and there's a link there where you can subscribe to our email list. I encourage people to do that because we can't always depend on social media in the world today. We know that that is a growing concern among people, as their ability to rely upon social media. So it's much better if we can keep in touch by direct email. So go in and subscribe, do that to subscribe to our email list. You can also, would like to ask you to subscribe to this channel, click the notification bell so you get notified when new videos come out. Of course, like this video. Let us know what you think in the comments and participate in the discussions in the comments. And share this video with your friends by email and through social media, Facebook groups that are relevant, etc. We'd appreciate all of that as well. All right, let's get going here, talking about the question of meat offered up to idols. So in Acts 15, we are told that Gentiles don't need to be circumcised in order to be saved. Now, we've done a whole video about that, and I don't want to get bogged down on that issue. But they must still keep certain minimum levels of Torah observance, even as they continue to go to synagogue on Shabbat and learn the rest of the Torah. If you read Acts 15 very closely, that's what it actually says. In fact, Acts 15 says that refers to the fact that these people are going to synagogue every Shabbat and hearing the Torah taught. Okay, so if you're not going to synagogue and having the Torah taught to you, then Acts 15 doesn't even apply to you. Okay, I'll leave it at that. We did a whole separate video understanding Acts 15 in the past, but one of the regulations that Acts 15 gives is a minimum requirement for the Gentiles that are studying Torah in the synagogue in Acts 15, is that they must abstain from things offered up to idols. That's in Acts chapter 15, verses 20 and 29, and it's repeated in Acts chapter 21, verse 25. Moreover, in the book of Revelation, the assembly at Thyatira is condemned for eating things offered up to idols. So this is a significant point that is prohibited, and it's prohibited because it's the outer limits of idolatry. So the four things that are listed in Acts 15 doesn't mean that, oh, well, you can go murder somebody. What it means is that those are the minimum requirements, the furthest outer reaches. And so the furthest outer reaches of the definition of idolatry, for example, is even eating meat offered up to idols. Now in Acts chapter 8, verses 1 through 13, and then in chapter 10, verse 7, and verses 14 through 28, Paul also addresses the issue of eating meat offered up to idols. And 1 Corinthians is really a halakhic book. It's a Jewish book, and I will probably be doing some video about that in the future. The first 3 chapters of 1 Corinthians are an extended form of what's called a proem homiletic midrash. It's a formal form of midrash, and the first 3 chapters interlock 2 proem homiletic midrashes and bring them together to form a sort of extended midrash through that is the first 3 chapter introduction to the book, and then the book addresses a number of halakhic issues in a very much Mishnaic, Gemaric type fashion. And so here in 1 Corinthians chapters 8, 1 through 13, and chapter 10, verses 7 and 14 through 28, Paul deals with this halakhic issue about meat offered up to idols. And the casual reader will sometimes, it has been accused that Paul argued that Paul contradicts what we read in Acts and Revelation about eating meat offered up to idols, because Acts and Revelation say don't eat meat offered up to idols, abstain from that. And Paul says in his text, he seems to say, and I'm just going very generic, you can go read the passages, he seems to say it's okay to eat meat offered up to idols. That's the argument, at least, but that's not really what he says if you understand the text properly. So the halakhic issue that Paul questions is not whether one should eat meat offered up to idols. Now remember, the question here is idolatry. So Paul is going to deal halakhically in very much the same manner as the Gemara and the Mishnah and the Gemara deal with these kinds of issues. He's going to really explore the nuances in Talmudic fashion, if you will, of what constitutes eating meat offered up to idols, and how what the halakha of that is, how we walk that out, how we do it, how we practice it. Okay, and Paul deals with a specific halakhic question, a specific halakhic issue, just like the Mishnah would or the Gemara would. His question is whether one must ask whether meat has been offered up to idols. And Paul argues, based on Psalm 24, verse 1, which he quotes in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 26 and 28, that meat is not actually altered by the idol, but that eating such meat appears to endorse the idol to which it was offered. In other words, why do we not eat? Paul's question isn't whether we eat meat offered up to idols, but why do we not eat meat offered up to idols? And the question is this because of the idolatry aspect or because of some dietary issue? And Paul comes to the conclusion, based on Psalm 24 verse 1, that the meat is not actually altered by the idol. The idol has no power to alter the meat. That false gods have no power to make a alteration of the substance of the food that's been offered up to them. No real change in that food is made or actuated by the false god, because it's a false god. It's a fiction. Okay. So Paul argues that the meat, since the meat is not actually altered, then the reason we don't eat the meat offered up to the idols is not because it's been substantively changed by the idol, but because it appears to others to endorse the idolatry. So that if Bill sees me eat meat that's been offered up to Baal, okay, then Bill is going to think that I advocate Baal worship. And that will influence Bill negatively. It might influence Bill to also worship Baal because he thinks I do. Okay. So I shouldn't eat meat offered up to idols because it is a bad witness to others, and it's an act of idolatry in that it appears to endorse the idolatry. And there are instances where this has some real application today. For example, there's a Krishna vegetarian restaurant I've heard of, if it's still there, in Dallas, Texas, for example, and probably in other locations, where the food has been offered up to the Hindu god Krishna. There may be other situations where I heard of a situation where there was a Chinese restaurant where the buffet was all gathered around a statuette of Buddha. And one might feel like that was indicating that the food had been offered up to an idol. So there are real issues where this takes place. And then there are other halakhic issues that could be questioned about, well, does that mean that chocolate Easter eggs, what is that, or a chocolate Easter bunny, or chocolate Santa Claus? Those are halakhic issues that we have to deal with in our own community in the present. Okay, but the issue Paul wants to deal with is, do I need to ask? Okay, and we're going to deal with a couple of issues surrounding that. But Paul concludes that if the meat has been advertised as having been offered to idols, then believers may not eat it, since that would appear to endorse the idol. Okay, so if there's a food, got a big neon sign over it, says offered up to Zeus, it's asur, it's prohibited. I am prohibited from eating that food. I may not eat it. I may not knowingly eat meat offered up to idols. So, if it's advertised as having been offered to idols, then I am not to eat it. However, Paul also concludes that since the idol has no real power to alter the meat, I am not required to ask if it's been offered to idols out of the blue, since that would imply to the person that I'm asking that I believe that idols have some power to to alter meat. So then by asking, I'm actually crossing the line into idolatry, in that by asking, I'm having exactly the same effect as by eating meat that's been offered up to idols, that's been advertised as having been offered up to idols, because by asking, I'm also implying that I believe that Baal is real, for example, or Zeus is real, and that Zeus has some power over Elohim's creation to alter the structure and the substance of the meat. Meaning by that if you knew enough about the molecular structure, the atomic structure, even the quantum structure of the meat, you ultimately figure out how to build some kind of detector where you could actually test that meat and determine that it had been offered up to Baal. And you can't. That could never happen because the idol actually has no power to impact the atomic structure of the meat. So if the meat has been offered up to idols, Paul says it's asur, we can't eat it. If the meat has been advertised as offered up to idols, then we're prohibited from eating it. If there is no such advertising, then I'm asur, I'm prohibited from asking, because asking has the same effect of implying that idols have power. So there's a reason for this in Paul's thinking. By the way, Paul's final halakha on this is stated in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 28, when he says, "But if a man should say to you that this is that which is sacrificed, you should not eat, for the sake of the one who told you, and because of conscience." In other words, if someone says this has been offered up to idols, it's asur, you're prohibited from eating it, because you then would appear to them to be endorsing the idolatry. The basis for Paul's argument here can be found in a story in 2nd Maccabees, a Hanukkah story, in the book of 2nd Maccabees, chapter 6, verses 1 through 29. I encourage you all to go read and study it. There's also a reference to this same event in the book of 4th Maccabees, but that's beyond the scope of today's study. So this is an account found in 2nd Maccabees chapter 6, verses 1 through 29, about a certain martyr named Eleazar. So Eleazar was a prominent Jew under the Hellene rule, under the rule of the Greco-Syrians of Antiochus Epiphanes. And a day came when all the Jews were supposed to show their loyalty by eating meat that had been offered to idols at a public feast. And Eleazar was not willing to do this. But because of his prominence, everybody kind of liked him. The authorities liked him. The authorities offered to allow him to sneak kosher meat that had not been offered up to idols into the event, into this banquet, and eat that meat instead, to just, slip it out of his cloak onto his plate and pretend like he was eating the same meat everyone else was that had been offered up to idols, and thus committing an act of idolatry. And the point of 2nd Maccabees chapter 6 is that this would have been an act of idolatry, even though the meat had not actually been offered up to idols. It would have been an act of idolatry because it would have appeared to endorse the idolatry, because people would have believed he was eating meat offered up to idols, or at least he would have been apparently advocating eating meat offered up to idols. And so the authorities basically told him, do that, we'll look the other way, we promise you none of us will notice that you actually pulled out some kosher meat and ate that instead. Eliezer refused to do this because he knew it would appear to endorse idolatry, and so he took the stand that this would endorse idolatry to his people, and it would therefore violate the mitzvot against idolatry. And as a result of his refusal to participate, he was executed. So the point of this account is it demonstrates that eating meat offered to idols is wrong, not because the meat itself was altered by the idol, but because it implied an endorsement of the idolatry. Paul would have been familiar with this account. His audience was familiar with this account. This was definitely something that would be in their minds as Paul is writing. It's the behind the scenes, if you will, Hebrew roots. It is the behind the scenes information that you need to know to understand what Paul is saying. In other words, you have to understand what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians according to its Second Temple era cultural historical context. And in its Second Temple era cultural historical context, Paul is teaching in light of 2 Maccabees chapter 6. He doesn't have to bring it up directly. His audience knows it. He knows it. His audience knows it. It shapes their thinking. You don't know it, perhaps, more than likely. Many of you don't know it. Therefore, when you're reading 1 Corinthians chapters 8 and 10, you don't have that background information. And so you may come to wrong conclusions about what Paul is saying, because you don't have the correct cultural historical background to understand the material. That's why I'm sharing this with you. Now you do. Now you know the story. You can actually, I don't like to use the word story, I'm correcting myself here, account. This is the account. And you can go study it yourself in 2 Maccabees chapter 6 verses 1 through 29. It's in the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha were part of the Bible before they were taken out. We've done a whole video on that, I believe, in the past. If not, we will in the future. But the 1611 King James Version, for example, included the book of 2 Maccabees. Now, they had moved it to an appendix, but it was in the Bible, in a section called the Apocrypha. Okay, so the point is that this account demonstrates eating meat offered to idols is wrong, not because the meat itself has been altered, but because it implies an endorsement of idolatry. Therefore, Paul's interpretation doesn't conflict with Acts 15, but actually implies a very strict interpretation by which eating kosher meat would also be forbidden if the meat had falsely been advertised as being offered up to an idol. Paul's question is, do I ask? Do I ask? And the reason that the question is asked, it becomes relevant, is because it's all about implying that the meat has been offered, advertising that the meat had been offered up to idols, regardless of whether it was or was not. It's all about the idea whether the idol actually alters the meat, or whether eating the meat offered up to idols seems to endorse the idolatry, gives an appearance of endorsement of idolatry. In the case of Eliezer, it would have endorsed the idolatry for Eliezer to eat kosher meat that had been advertised as being offered up to idols, just like in Paul's example, it would, where the person has to ask, it also implies that the idol has power over the meat to ask. So there's really three situations here that we can see in all of these accounts. We can see that it's forbidden to eat meat that's been offered up to idols, even if it hasn't. That it's forbidden to eat meat that's been offered to idols if it has. And it's forbidden to ask, because that in itself implies that the idol has power. And all three of these have in common that we don't want to imply to others that we believe idols have power, or we don't want to endorse idolatry to others through any of these three different but related acts. So another question that comes up that I hear from time to time, and this comes from people that really thinking this through from a Jewish perspective, oftentimes, sometimes from Orthodox or rabbinic Jewish critics, the question is posed, why would it even be an issue? If these people in question are Torah observant, if they're eating kosher, then why would these people be buying meat from anything other than a kosher butcher? Why would they be buying meat at a Gentile marketplace anyway? Why would they be buying meat at a place where there would even be a question whether it had been offered up to idols? Now, the answer to this is found in the actual Aramaic of the text. And this is one of the things that I like to do in my own personal study that contributes to my commentaries and the things that I teach to you, is that I study these texts in the original Hebrew and Aramaic. So I study 1 Corinthians in the Aramaic of the Peshitta Aramaic text. And one of the ways that I study that text, and then I study the Aramaic, Old Syriac and Peshitta versions of the New Testament, of the books of the New Testament, is that I'll do word studies on the Aramaic as Paul is using it, or other authors in the New Testament are using it. I'll do a word study on the Aramaic, and I'll take the Aramaic that is used in a passage, and I'll look keywords up in this book. This is also part of what I call the Talmud toolkit for Talmud students, but that's another matter. Here, this is the Jastro's dictionary, and it's called the Dictionary of the Targumim, Talmud Bavli, Yerushalmi, and Midrashic Literature by Professor Marcus Jastrow. Okay, and with this book, you can look up an Aramaic word, and it will give you not only a definition of the word, but examples for each definition of places where that word is used in the Talmuds, the Babylonian Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud, or the Targums. And so I did exactly that here in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 25, where it says, whatever is sold in the shambles, in the King James Version it's shambles, some versions say whatever is sold in the markets or the meat markets, that eat, asking no questions for conscience sake. Now the Aramaic word here is maklon. Okay? This Aramaic word appears in the Talmud. In Tractate Hulin 95a of the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate 95a, this is actually a section of Talmud, a portion of Gemara, which is discussing various situations about this kind of meat and whether it's acceptable to eat it or not. Paul's statements material in 1 Corinthians 8 and chapter 10 that we referenced in this study today actually would fit quite well as one of the rabbis being cited in the Gemara debating these issues and offering insights on these issues in this particular tractate, in this particular portion in Gemara that's being discussed. And what it says here is, Rob said, meat which has disappeared from sight is forbidden. An objection was raised. Rabbi says, where the meat stalls, and the word here for meat stalls is maklon, and this is a reference, when we continue, where the meat stalls kept by Gentiles are supplied with meat by Israelite butchers, any meat found in the possession of the Gentile is permitted. It is different where it is found in the possession. It is different where it is found in the possession of the Gentile. So, in the Talmud, this word maklon is being used to refer to butchers, meat shops that are owned by Gentiles but employ Jewish kosher butchers to provide kosher meat. It's rather analogous to going to Kroger today, or Albertsons perhaps, certain stores, I don't know which one, which have a kosher meat section, or have kosher food in general, with a certification on it, and it's in the possession of Gentiles. It's a Gentile-owned, let's say it's a Gentile-owned store, okay? But it employs Jewish personnel, Jewish butchers. Perhaps they have the meat section has a Jewish butcher there, and his job is, manning the meat market. And at any rate, they produce and have kosher meats there. In ancient times, there were such things. There were Gentile-owned markets in composite communities that had Jewish people living in them, that had kosher Jewish butchers working for them, providing and selling kosher meat out of their Gentile-owned store or maklon. So this same word is being used in the Talmud to refer to that kind of a market. So that's why the ancient Nazarenes referenced here in 1 Corinthians would have been buying meat at a maklon, at a Gentile-owned butcher, or a Gentile-owned meat market that employed Jewish or sold kosher meat. Okay. So this resolves that question as well for any that had any doubts about that. So there's no conflict between what Paul is teaching about meat offered up to idols and Acts chapter 15 and the Jewish law that's expressed in the Talmud itself here as well. One may not knowingly eat meat that's been offered up to idols. However, when buying meat that's not been advertised as having been offered up to idols, one should not ask. So when you're buying meat, you shouldn't go over and ask, by the way, has this been offered up to any idols? Because that's kind of a weird question to ask, and it sounds like you believe that if it had, it would have changed the atomic structure of the meat. But if you're eating meat that nobody actively said or advertised had been offered up to idols, then you don't need to worry about it, because the idol didn't change the meat, and you're not appearing to endorse idolatry to anyone. So I hope that clears up, helps you understand this portion of 1 Corinthians. There are a lot of confusing portions of 1 Corinthians. I'll talk about maybe some more of them in the future, and I may even do a through 1 Corinthians series like I did in the past on Romans and Galatians. All right. I want to remind everybody to please donate to support this work. We need your help. You make this possible. Click on the donate link in the video description, and also click on the link to get signed up to receive our free emails, and keep in touch with us by in that way as well. All right. Until next time, shalom, everyone.